I couldn't have put it better myself. There are great concerns in the CAB in Wolverhampton that not only are they facing a cut in legal aid, but they're also facing a cut in the Financial Inclusion Fund, which I will refer to briefly in my contribution a little later. I want to come on to the issue of the day. I know there's a lot of members who are concerned about the cost of the legal aid budget. Well, I will say this. Let's not forget that the starting point for our debate today, as recognised actually in the government's own Green Paper, is that 500,000 people in our country get help from the legal aid budget. That is a sign of a civilised country. It is something to be proud of, not to be attacked and not to be ashamed of. So although obviously we have to look at the costs involved, I would remind colleagues of the point that I made earlier, that the previous government were looking at these issues, and actually in the last 10 years, in terms of civil legal aid, there was a reduction in real terms of 24%. I think also under consideration was capping the fees being paid to solicitors and barristers and getting better value for money for the taxpayer by looking at how contracts were awarded and seeking out economies of scale. But these sorts of rationalisation are a far cry from removing whole categories of legal aid from the budget. For example, family law, which has been mentioned by other honourable members, welfare benefits, debt, housing and education. I want to refer specifically to withdrawing legal aid in the case of welfare benefits. Around 80% of the social welfare legal aid cases that the CAB deals with record positive outcomes for the individual involved. This just goes to show that there are issues here. And at a time when the government is bringing forward deep and far-reaching welfare reform, it is precisely the wrong... I don't think they should be doing it anyway, by the way, but it is precisely the wrong time to be taking this completely out of the scope of legal aid. I will.
Would my Green not also agree that the poor quality of decision-making in the social security system also creates an increased need for legal aid? And whilst we all naturally hope that that level of decision-making can be improved, and that I hope that the government will give that attention, in the meantime it is really important that people have that protection, particularly, for example, when we look at the high rate of successful appeals against decisions on employment and support allowance.
I couldn't agree more, and members across the House know that these examples come up time and time again in their surgeries. For example, the other day I had somebody come to my surgery who's been overpaid benefits and now has got a massive sum of money to be paid back, yet that wasn't their fault in the first place. The state has responsibility to these people. I will indeed.
Lillian Greenwood.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. Would she be as shocked as I was to hear from Nottingham Law Centre that 42% of the clients whose problems they help to solve are caused by administrative or procedural errors by government departments and local authorities? And does she share my concern that a lot of those constituents who had help have very poor levels of education, and some of them struggle with literacy, and without legal assistance from the Law Centre they simply won't be able to resolve those problems?
I couldn't agree more with my honourable friend, and this goes to the heart of the argument today. These cuts are going to affect the most vulnerable in our society. Yet another example of government cuts hitting the poorest hardest. I want to briefly refer to taking debt also wholesale out of the legal aid budget. The government has recognised in its own Green Paper that many of these people who are mired in debt are ill or disabled, and that debt often afflicts the most vulnerable in society, but they are still proceeding to take forward proposals and measures which will deny these people access to legal advice and representation. And I'm going to briefly mention something that I raised in the House last week. I asked the Leader of the House what was going to happen to the future of the Financial Inclusion Fund, which is a great source of help for people having debt problems. And in Wolverhampton, there are some hundreds of people who are helped every year due to this fund. And I was given wise counsel by the Leader of the House that I should raise this morning, and that the Minister, he would assure, would give me an answer on this. I know that this is being administered by Biz and Treasury, but I would urge the Minister to give us some clarity on whether this fund is going to go ahead beyond March. Again, the uncertainty that my honourable friends have already raised is at stake here, and it is not helpful at all. I don't want to be too long, Mrs Riordan, because I know that there are other colleagues who want to get in. So I wanted to just add that apart from failing the test of social justice, these proposals also fail on a cost-benefit analysis. And my honourable friend for Westminster North has very eloquently explained that in many areas these cuts are a false economy. And the CAB's business case for legal aid, which was only published this year, says that for every £1 of legal aid expenditure on housing advice, the state saves £2.34. For every £1 on debt advice, the state saves £2.98. On welfare benefits, the state saves £8.80. On employment advice, the state potentially saves £7.13. Has the government looked properly at the savings that early intervention makes possible, and have they done a proper cost-benefit analysis of the costs that their proposals are going to imply for public services down the line? I fear that this is short-sighted, that they are seeking short-term savings at significant cost later on down the line, and other colleagues have made the same arguments. Also, the other thing I'm particularly worried about is the government says in its Green Paper that other alternatives will be available, and it goes on to tell us where these alternatives are. But I listened to the CAB again, and they say, and I know my honourable friend for Westminster North has already used this quote, but I think that it is very telling. The CAB say that the overwhelming majority of their client group will not be able to access the alternatives that I identified in the Green Paper. I will indeed.
Friend agree with me that the other alternative that is suggested, which is an expansion of telephone advice, whilst it's welcome, and I agree there is not enough telephone information available, is not suitable to the most vulnerable in our society, particularly for people in debt who quite often use mobile phones and cut themselves off to save the money.
I couldn't agree more with my honourable friend. There is no substitute for face-to-face counselling and advice, and these cuts will mean that these very vulnerable people, as my honourable friend has rightly stated, have only recourse is some kind of telephone system that they themselves are not comfortable with and might not even be able to afford to use. I'm going to wrap up, Mrs Riordan, because I know that other colleagues want to contribute. I very quickly say that I think that the proposals in the government's Green Paper will make the poor poorer, the most vulnerable more vulnerable, and the cuts should fall elsewhere. There are other ways of reforming the legal aid budget and the legal aid system, and the government should think again. Thank you.